Well, we're continuing to monitor the series of suspicious packages sent across the country, some of which CBS News has confirmed contained explosive devices. At least 10 packages have been sent to people who are frequently singled out by criticism by the president. The latest 2 packages addressed to former Vice President Joe Biden, a third to actor Robert De Niro. CBS News Chief Justice and Homeland Security correspondent Jeff Pegues joins me now from Washington. So, Jeff, what's the working theory at this point about who could be behind all this?
Well, listen, this is someone who has taken the time to send out all of these suspicious devices. Now, whether this is one person or more than one person, that is still something that investigators are mulling over and looking into. But obviously, this is one of those cases that I think, looking back, once it is solved, and it'll likely be solved, will be one of those textbook cases that investigators look to solve future crimes. And you have this device or devices similar to this one that were sent around to these different locations. They look at the addresses on there, the stamps, looking to see whether they can get DNA or fingerprints. And that's what they're doing now with this case. The race is on to track down whoever is responsible for this. And of course, the more of these devices that are out there, it, of course, increases the likelihood that someone could possibly get hurt. And, of course, investigators don't want that to happen.
Jeff, what more do we know about these actual devices?
Well, what is happening now is that the investigators, and specifically when it comes to examining the components of these devices, ultimately it will be the FBI, their lab in Quantico, Virginia. They will go through the components of these devices to see where they were purchased. Because, for example, in the Austin bombing case back in March, they looked at the components of those bombs. You might remember that 2 people died in that case. But what investigators did was they looked at the components of those bombs. And what they found was one of the components was a battery, a unique battery. And that is what ultimately helped lead them to the suspect. He was also caught on surveillance video, and that was important too. But they can look at these components of these devices and narrow down where the components were purchased and then who might have purchased them. How do they do that? Well, typically these days, most people use credit cards. And so as soon as they have that credit card information, of course, they have an address and they go from there. So they will examine these components and other things out there that they find, given the vast amount of evidence or potential evidence that they now have. And they will use all of that to narrow down the field of suspects.
Do you think we'll get a profile of a suspect or who they think might be behind this anytime soon?
Sure. I mean, we're already seeing that develop now. I mean, the last few days, starting with the Soros incident on Monday, every time you get one of these suspicious packages, it helps these investigators develop these profiles. At the FBI, they have a behavioral analysis unit. They look into, we've worked with them in the past where they've looked into active shooters. Well, you're going to have a similar case building here with these analysts. They look over some of the evidence data that they get, and with that, they can put together a profile of who they might be looking for, what his motive or intentions may be. And so that is the kind of thing that investigators start fairly early on, especially with a case like this where they're working against the clock to make sure that nobody gets hurt and that they can discover all of these different devices. So they're working on that now. We've heard talk about the potential of this being a domestic terrorist type, someone who lives in the U.S. who is doing this through some sort of political motivation. And so that appears to be the working theory right now. But of course, investigators, the way they work, they don't want to rule anything out, at least not yet. It's still too early for that.
All right, Jeff Pegues, thank you so much, Jeff.
My pleasure.